Welcome to Tapping Wisdom. I'm Sue Paternack, and I'm delighted to introduce William Hernández Requejo, who is a colleague of mine at the University of California, Irvine, Paul Merage School of Business. Go Anteaters! I'm right. I'm very happy to ask him to join us for this Tapping Wisdom interview. I, as many of you know, teach the basics of negotiations courses in the MBA programs there, and William teaches the global negotiations courses. So I thought my audience would be really interested in hearing what his perspective is in terms of where we are today in global negotiations and where it looks like we're going in terms of global negotiations. So let me start by asking you, William, if you would please introduce yourself to our audience and tell us how you came to doing this work.
Well, first and foremost, thank you, Sue, for this opportunity just to be able to share with you an ongoing manner in which we've collaborated over the past many years. It truly is a privilege to be here with you and the wonderful programs and events that you put together. So my actual international experience happened actually here at UCI, and it happened my junior year in undergraduate studies. I was a political science major, and in that capacity, my father had actually passed, and my grandfather came to me and said, you should go back to your mother country, which is actually originally from Spain. And so in that capacity, my grandfather sent me to study in the Education Abroad program in Spain, and that was a transformative moment. That actually got me to look at the world within an international context. From there, I fell in love with the language. As many people know, when you're raised in the United States and you have a secondary language, it's usually at a maternal level. And so it doesn't grab that level of sophistication. But once you travel and once you study in a foreign language, then you acquire that. And I fell in love with the language. I came back to UCI, grabbed a master's degree in Spanish, and then told my grandfather that I wanted to be a poet. And my grandfather said, "This is really wonderful. Go to law school." So it was in that capacity then I went to Georgetown Law, specializing in international transactional work, and then began my practice at Buckhalter, Niemer, Fields and Younger, where I was doing a lot of the transactional work as a junior attorney, where I was miserable. I was absolutely miserable. I was working extremely long hours. And then one of my law professors came up to me and says, "Hey, are you happy?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And he goes, "Well, let me suggest something to you." And he actually offered an opportunity for me to assist in a strategic alliance back in Spain. Once I was in Spain, I got the chance to serve essentially doing a lot of the strategic alliances, joint ventures. I facilitated many companies that were going through that period coming into Spain at that time, including the Fluor Corporation and AST and Microsoft and Infosys, and the U.S. Embassy had very kindly sort of picked me to assist in that region of Spain. If a company wanted to go there, that they in turn would do that. And so what actually ended up happening was that I was there for 3 years, and in those 3 years, we got an opportunity to do a lot of strategic alliances and joint ventures, where I would bring in then local counsel to facilitate. And I came to realize precisely what some of those issues were, and those included the things that then brought me back into the United States. At that time, my wife then wanted to have children, and so that all became now part of the thought process in working internationally, and what we would describe as the international worker dilemma. What do you want to do, especially if you have a family? And if you might suspect, this is before technology really had kicked in really hard. So the ability to make a phone call was about the best you could do, and then email came in, and then it became much more the world to some extent that we have today. But after we came back, one of my clients that I had there was Fluor Corporation, and they actually said, "Hey, we like the work you did." And then I started working on the Fluor Corporation, and that became the Camisea project. That's the #1 in chapter 1 of my book, where I described some of those negotiations, and it served as a basis for ongoing. How is it then that I got into the academic side? It was directly through a colleague of mine, John Graham, who was also the co-author of my book, in which case John was most
Shameless
certainly.
plug.
There we go. There we go. And so John and I met at a presentation with the Mexican ambassador, and we hit it off. We hit it off. John had done a lot of research in the area, and I had done a lot of the practice in the area. And so we said, hey, our skill set should be combined. And so we created the basis upon which now served me academically. We co-taught classes that led then to me going ahead and teaching classes on my own, and there brought me to bear within a much more academic context.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that background, because I think what that does, it helps to inform the conversations that we've had about the American negotiation style. And while in your book you talked about Adam Smith, John Wayne, that goes back a ways. So where do you think the current and it's so hard to say American because there's so much variety within the United States, right? Depending on which region you're in. So perhaps it's how we're perceived externally outside the U.S. that's more homogenous than how we perhaps actually are. So how is the American negotiation style currently perceived, and where do you think it needs to go?
Well, that's actually an excellent question, in the sense that the United States and Americans have evolved, and they've evolved tremendously, especially since World War II. It was perhaps part of coming out of World War II that prior to that, we were known characteristically as the ugly Americans, and that was most certainly part. And to some extent, that's very justifiable, in the sense that we were a self-sustained sort of country prior to World War II. There was some participation in the World War I, obviously, but we were still relatively isolated. We had both oceans on both sides, and so there was a sort of a self-reinforcing cultural mechanism that really negated a lot of the external world. Coming out of World War II, and you can very well imagine that's when all the international organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, etc., all as a result of the Bretton Woods scenario. And the United States then slowly but surely started becoming much more globalized. That is, recognizing the area around the world outside of that. I'm overly simplifying this, obviously, right? But what I have noticed, and in particular, is that once the United States had successfully established its international presence as if not then, the one of two superpowers, and then now subsequent with the fall of the Soviet Union, one superpower, and then now potentially looking at a multilateral, multipolar type of international structure. What happened was that the United States then, in essence, stopped being the ugly American, because now many of these countries that are now playing on the global stage and have not had that same level of international experience, now they are viewed as the ugly foreigner, right? And so to that extent,
by Americans,
by
in general,
right?
in general,
right? In general. And that's partially because now we find that well, I can speak about China, I can speak about Russia, I can speak about some of the other countries that have now interjected themselves on the global stage. And they have not had that international experience that that the United States has most certainly had as it came upon the global stage.
And I just want to clarify, we're talking about in the business community in general, certainly not in politics, right? So we're talking about business people,
Most,
and,
yeah,
corporate entities.
well, yes, I would agree with that. However, much of that is subject to the interplay between corporations and the politics inherent within a certain country, right? In a
Fair
certain
enough. Yep. Mhm.
So, but I would most certainly agree. But in doing so, what happens is that we found ourselves really working through a process where some of these other countries now that have not had this globalized experience now really are in many ways viewed by the world as literally the ugly foreigner, right? That doesn't understand how to work with that culture. And it was precisely along those lines that I came to realize, oh, so the United States now has taken on this new role. But specifically going back to the issue of the John Wayne phenomena is really premised on the concept of an individualist culture. And within that individualism, which is absolutely part and parcel of what it is to be an American and the ideology.
And it still is, yeah.
And still most certainly is where that comes into play, that the concept of collectivity is now many times viewed as one of the counterpoints to the ideology associated with individualism. So in that context, we actually see that although the United States in many ways still continues to be an individualist culture, it now has that awareness, that consciousness of, oh, look, there are other cultures that think differently. And so John Wayne is now in a situation that he recognizes that he can still be himself and yet at the same time be able to understand some of the unique cultural idiosyncrasies associated with collectivism in other cultures around the world.
Right. And so where do so kind of if we take that, there was also, way more homogeneity in the business culture, after World War II and through the many decades to where we are now, where there's much more heterogeneity in the workplace. So how does, where we are now, so if we're consciously aware of where we are, how skillfully are we doing that? And where do we need to go to be effective negotiators on the global scene?
So if I may, let me break down your question and observations at multiple levels.
Sure.
So first and foremost, in that dominant superpower position, corresponding to that political context, there were the corporations that came in, and for a very long time, the vast majority of the truly international, what we now euphemistically describe as multinational corporations, those were basically American. And so much of the leadership, much of the management style that was associated with that was most certainly associated with companies that were assuming a cultural hegemony. And within that, it was this imposition of power and within that international context. As slowly other countries began to have corporations and organizations that could then influence then what happened was that a lot of that analysis of what is the managerial style, what is the negotiation style of these companies, then they got into a position that, oh, perhaps I may need to adapt more to that other company if in fact I want to have a relationship with them, be that a strategic alliance, be that a buyer seller, et cetera, right? So within that context, then we saw this fluctuation within the character of the American manager / negotiator. And that's where it was right about 1995, with the advent of emails, with the advent of video conferencing in its early stages, I admit, and other technological advances, then that communicational system began to evolve, and now became a point of commonality in many ways. But what used to be directly driven by in-person relationships now has much more of a technological character, which is exemplified in this Zoom that we're doing here today. And so in that sense, new skills needed to be acquired. And among those is what's been euphemistically described as techno-literacy, your ability to interact effectively in order to conduct not only international work, but in particular, global negotiations.
Thank you for bringing that up. So I heard you use the term techno-literacy. I want to come back to that in a second, because I think the notion of just literacy in general, global literacy, is something that you brought up in your book as the human skills, regardless of where we are in our moment in time, right? Whether it's the future or the present. And you talked about 4 areas that are the kind of skill sets and competencies and levels of awareness that we need to master going forward as we're doing more and more negotiations on the global stage. And the 2, of course, in communication itself, language and nonverbals, values, which goes to mindset and belief systems, and thinking and decision-making processes. So if you could talk just a bit about those, and maybe even connect those to the techno-literacy, I think that would give us at least a bit of context for where we need to be going, to develop our global communication skills.
Well, thank you. I mean, in many ways, I thank you, because you really just, whether you were conscious of it or not, you raised many of my hot buttons. First and foremost, you probably know, and I know you do personally, but one of the main statements I make is that there is no such thing as international work. There is only interpersonal work done internationally. And so within that context,
that's a great quote. I'm going to put that in my description.
and within that context is where I actually believe all those other points you most certainly raised. It's in that capacity to be able to communicate effectively. One of the definitions of negotiations is nothing more than literally communication in order to be able to persuade. I mean, that's really one of the most basic attributes of negotiation. And yet within that larger cultural context, how you persuade becomes incredibly complex, depending on the underlying culture, on the underlying relationships that very well may happen, on the concepts of motivation and how that is viewed, and then also within the concepts of the cultural links associated to some extent with those earlier issues that we said, collectivity, right? Because many times it is not necessarily, as we many times hold sacrosanct, that what motivates us in the United States is money. In many other cultures of the world, it very well may be your position or status within your group, right? Within your collectivity, and indeed, the incredible value that has, right? Being aware of that from a communicational standpoint is fundamental. The second part that and redirect me again, please. The second part that you alluded to was,
to what extent are those very human skills, which are timeless, right? Which is why I like. So it's the 4, verbal, language, nonverbal skills, language, beliefs and values, and your thinking and decision-making processes. how then those become part of the techno-literacy that you were talking about. I find that fascinating.
So the second part of that, I'll describe basically as being able to change your behavior, right? How you behave within this larger context that means non-oral communications. Are you gesticulating too much? How is your inflection, what we sometimes describe as para-linguistic input, and how that is perceived by the other. Many times, as you very well know, within our profession of as educators, what we actually recognize is there's a certain level of entertainment that must be established. And that entertainment can have very logical, very methodical types of attributes to it. Some of it can very well be much more interactive, where you have much more of an interactivity. And sometimes that entertainment is very passionate, very high end, in order to attract the type of student that maybe perhaps does not wish to engage in that participation. And in doing so, you notice that we have altered our behavior. Well, to some extent, we have to do that within global negotiations as well. Depending on the receptivity according to the cultural attributes of your counterpart, that most certainly would come into play.
So that reminds me of, not only am I an American, but I'm also, even though I'm in Southern California, I am and will still always be a New Yorker. And right. And so my negotiation style, naturally, is, I mean what I say what I mean, I get straight to the point. It's a straight line. I learned very quickly, working in international companies and early in my career, that some cultures were similar to that and other cultures found that quite offensive. And then when I moved to Southern California, I further found that even within my own country, that, the Northeastern kind of direct sensibility didn't work so well out West. So I love what you're saying about changing behavior, because it connotes an adaptability and a flexibility, right? And and there's a plasticity to how we interact, and we can learn how to do that. We're not fixed. It's that kind of growth mindset. It's not I am this way, therefore this is how I do it, right? It's this is how I've been, and I can add to that.
Absolutely, and sort of to put it within, as you very well know, within technical terminology, it's the difference between sometimes what we describe as a relationship-oriented society or culture, and then a task-oriented society or culture. We in the United States, as a general rule, and there are exceptions and microcultures and regions that differ, but there is, by all means, we are a task-oriented society, and within that context, it sometimes it's shocking within a relationship-based society. And in my book, there's several where I've wanted to get to the task in many meetings because of time constraints, and I was not allowed to because there were certain protocol relationship building issues that had to be developed first before we were able to even get to the task at hand.
And developing the patience for that, when you want to get straight to the point, your time pressure, takes a level of emotional composure, which requires an emotional self-awareness and a social awareness of what the circumstances require, right? So if we went straight to the point, it would be a non-starter.
Right, and one of the ways I describe that is the ability, and that's that self-awareness or consciousness, as I describe it, to just remove yourself from yourself and see yourself from someone else's eyes, right? Oh, look at how I'm behaving. Look at how they're perceiving that behavior. Let me change to be able to conduct myself. And if you don't change that and you continue that behavior, that you're doing it consciously for whatever you perceive that to be the task at hand, right? And so it becomes this more acute level of awareness. But that, by all means, requires a tremendous amount of information. And sort of, if you'll allow me to go sort of back to that earlier concept of techno-literacy.
Good. Yeah, that's where I was hoping to go. Yeah.
One of the most amazing tools that have just come onto this sector, but into many other sectors, is this generative artificial intelligence, or now OpenAI, Chat GPT, in which we now find ourselves where a lot of the heavy lifting that's most certainly part of global negotiation can now be very efficiently done to a fairly high level. There are some issues at multiple levels still with artificial intelligence, but even at that level, you're able to develop a lot of what in my book is described as environmental scanning, where you see the environment that you're around. And that part of that environment is through the acquisition of information.
So that's that's the heart of it. So the environmental scanning is here, right?
It's the tail, it's what moves the fish, right?
Exactly.
Right. And you'll notice if in the book, you'll notice that it has an awful lot of issues, including how to grab information on politics, on finance, on economics. And you can see some of those, including technology, demographics, etc. And then the last three are the planning, preparation, and procedures. I've always argued if you do your homework up front, you then become a much better global negotiator. And so
absolutely. And what I love about what you said about Chat GPT is it helps to build efficiency. It could do some of the initial legwork, and and as educators and as subject matter experts, we are the final arbiters of whether that's accurate, right? Because we know while there are some flaws, by going through a set of eyes, right? Doing basically, QC, doing quality control, just making sure that it's accurate, and then it can go through, but it's saved quite a bit of time in data collection. Yeah.
It does. And I'll paraphrase what you just said. It's putting back the human quality to it, right? Putting back the ability to understand, because we've obviously recognized that there are biases as well within Chat GPT. We have them ourselves, okay? So we have to recognize that, but Chat has them as well, right? Chat GPT. So in that sense, number two is sometimes Chat hallucinates. I mean, it just literally creates false statements, and we don't know why that happens, and that most certainly. And then the other part, the human part that I call it, sometimes its values are not necessarily aligned with our human values. And so it may take a position where it's actually the wrong position because it has not understood the various values that we many times hold true. So that's where it comes into play, and it's radically changing, I believe, much of the world in that working environment, where a lot of the grunt work that needs to be done can now be done relatively efficiently, but yet you still do have to go in to do that. Along those lines, just a few days ago, for the very first time in my global negotiation class, we got a chance to use Chat GPT in class in a negotiation.
Oh my. Can you tell that just real briefly? That's fun.
So we had I forced the class to buyer-seller dyad, in which the students needed to initially engage in Romanian. They were selling Romanian shoes to the retailer Zara, right? And they were selling these, and so they had to do so. First of all, engage in Romanian to then discover a common language that they could in turn use to be able to communicate verbally, right? Now, you realize that eventually there'll be a simultaneous translator with your voice, artificial intelligence going towards that. But what also happens is that they got a chance to do that. From there, they then did a lot of the preliminary work, research with regards to what the expectations are. They were able to provide proposals, and a couple of groups actually did something that I found very innovative. Rather than negotiating some of the issues in general and then put those within a contract, what they did is they had Chat create the contract using both prompts within that The contract then became the central point that each side then said,
Oh my gosh.
I agree with this language, I don't agree with this one. And then you negotiated the idiosyncrasies of the contract. But what was amazing about that, because I had never seen that ever in my life,
Yeah.
was that we now had common ground. We had something upon which to build the
Oh.
scaffolding for this. And I found that to be just amazingly revelatory.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I'm gonna have to check this out. That is very cool. Thank you for sharing that story. William, we've talked about a lot. We've talked about context. We've talked about the humanity. We talked about the tools. We talked about the future. We've talked about the history. What have I not asked that would be helpful to know, or that you would like to share?
Well, I pause in responding to that, and part of that reason is that there's a very famous Greek. Well, I guess he was technically a philosopher, but his name is Meno, and if you were to come right outside my door here, you would see a sign on my door that says something akin to, "How do you go about researching something where the very existence of it is unknown to you," right?
Oh my. Whew.
How do you go about, right? How do you
Mind blow,
go
right?
about doing something like this, right?
Yeah.
What I'm discovering is that as we begin to develop in this area, a lot of what has heretofore, and please excuse my legal
Legal language.
terminology, yeah, we're siloed. What I'm seeing is that there happens to be a lot of multidisciplinary correlations that are now being possible. That is very much akin to the difference that now exists between narrow artificial intelligence and general artificial intelligence. In many ways, there's a lot of that process that's coming, ground up type of scenario rather than top down. There's fascinating work doing there that I'm looking forward to seeing if that can most certainly. I'm looking forward to doing some extensive research that's already started about a year and a half ago, that I'm looking to see how that can actually be promulgated.
Thank you. That's very exciting stuff. So let's summarize. What are 3 or so takeaways from our discussion that you think our audience could, kind of sit with, pen and pad and just jot down real quickly?
Probably the very first thing is observe. Look at the world around you. Look at everything around you. Be intellectually curious in why people do what they do. Do not take an ethnocentric position within that context. Step outside of that and just observe. Many times it's in that observation that truths reveal themselves, and within that is the very first suggestion. Perhaps the second suggestion within that observation is the internalization of information. I use the analogy of a photodiode in many of my courses, and it's very simple. A photodiode determines whether the light's on or off, and yet I ask everyone what distinguishes you from that, and all of a sudden the issue becomes, I ask if the light's on, you say the light's on, photodiode says the light's on. But if all of a sudden I turn on the light and the light's blue, now the photodiode says the light's on, you say the light's on, but it's blue. And that blue very well may permit you to do some abstract associations. Blue moon, I have the blues, or the blues as a variation of jazz. All of a sudden this comes in, right? That's the world. That's the world that I like to play in. Whereas many times you have that knee-jerk reaction, lights on. But upon that observation, you realize, and with information, you have now a lot more to contribute.
Almost sounds like you can use a kaleidoscope in there as well. right? As
Absolutely.
opposed to just like a telescope or you know, right, or binoculars. Yeah.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And then this third thing, which I think you raised here again, and I think you did it because of your background, is the the concept of time, the concept of patience. We in the United States are driven by a very different concept of time and how time is relevant, how time is functional, how time in the United States is linear, and in many times in the United States, in the world, it's not, in fact. In fact, time can, what we call polychronic, multiple meanings of time. Once you begin to work within that context, then you're able to transact in a very different manner. How you bridge those two concepts become perhaps some of the most critical points that can happen.
Thank you so much. And that was a great summary and additional content as well. And ending with time. So though our time is up, I'd like to give our audience an opportunity to connect with you. So how do people find you, William?
Well, I'm at UCI. You can obviously Google me. I show up in quite a few places. You'll be able to see some of my books. You'll be able to see my consulting firm where I do a lot of my practice. And then at the same time, you can always find me in the various directories at UCI, where I teach international management and global negotiations. Plus, every once in a while, I have the distinct honor and privilege of taking my students internationally.
Yes, absolutely. So you can be found on LinkedIn,
I
right?
can be found. Oh, absolutely.
Right. And what is your website?
My website is requejoconsulting.com. It's very straightforward, just like my second last name. And just you go in there and you should be able to find it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your insights and for your time, William. This was really, really fascinating. And I want to thank everybody for listening. This is Sue Paternack, and this has been Tapping Wisdom. See you next time.
Thank you.